I think we're on. We're on. Okay. I'm also going to edit this, dude.
I hope so.
So sorry. Okay. So this podcast is called Riffing on Social Innovation. And we're here talking today with Lindsay Telfer. Lindsay, why don't you tell our students who you are and what's your official title on your business card?
All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Telfer, and I am the National Project Director for the Canadian Freshwater Alliance.
Right. And what does that mean? What does that do?
The Canadian Freshwater Alliance is a national initiative which builds, supports, and strengthens freshwater constituencies across Canada. And that means we work with organizations, environmental groups, businesses, municipalities, governments at building supporters for freshwater health.
Excellent. So this is like a global issue you're dealing with at the local level?
Well, yeah, fresh water and clean access to clean water is certainly a global issue, and it's certainly an emerging threat across Canada.
Cool. So tell us how you got started in this. What's your background and why are you with the Freshwater Alliance and what is that?
Well, I got my background. I have a master's in environmental studies from York University. And immediately upon completion of my master's, I was hired as the National Director of the Sierra Youth Coalition, which at the time was Canada's largest student environmental organization in Canada. And that sort of set off my path in the nonprofit world. I worked at the Sierra Club for the better part of 10 years, both in that position at the Sierra Youth Coalition and then running the Sierra Club's Prairie chapter in Alberta for a number of years. I left that and co-founded the Freshwater Alliance 7 years ago now.
Wow. So tell us how that kind of came about. What did they just come up to you and say, "Hey, can you start Freshwater Alliance?"
Kind of.
So what happened here? How did this?
I moved across the country from Alberta back to Ontario in 2010. And went for lunch with a funder of mine. And as those lunches tend to go, I was starting to wonder what I was going to do when I came back to work. And he pitched a project to me and basically said, from your work in Alberta, did you notice this gap in the landscape? And that gap was a national initiative that strengthened and connected Canada's freshwater world. So freshwater work is naturally local. We work on the creeks in our backyard, the lakes that we swim in, and sometimes don't look up from that work. And so there is a needed gap in the landscape of connecting all of those local groups who are really focused on local issues to a larger scale.
Right. So your job was to tackle that, was to connect this local kind of issue to this larger kind of initiative. So tell us a little bit about that journey. How did that unfold?
Well, I mean, as any kind of connecting body, you need to have the support of your grassroots. And so the first step that we did in this initiative was a national landscape scan. I connected with organizations that I knew and had worked with, and some I was being introduced to discover what their needs were on the ground, what were the challenges that they were facing in their work locally, and what would they look to in a national initiative to strengthen and deepen their success on the ground. So it was this national landscape scan that really solidified the support for what we wanted to build.
Right. And so how'd you do that? So what did that look like to you guys? Was that like a bunch of questionnaires? Was it like...
It was a $500 cell phone bill that I was not expecting, because I spent so much time on the phone talking to people and got my phone bill and went, oh, there goes my consulting fees.
Wow. Okay. So you actually physically called people.
So yeah, it was a whole lot of time talking to people on the phone, exploring what their issues were, what their challenge, what their capacity challenges were. Were they supportive of an entity to help connect them with others across the country?
Wow. So after you got a cell phone bill shock, And how did you pick the questions? Like, what were you so you were asking them about capacity, you were asking them about, would this be a great idea? What were some of your responses? And what was the result of some of this, this fee for service?
Yeah.
To Rogers.
Right. So we did phone calls, and then we also did a survey. So I did about, now I'm going to have to dig into my archives a little bit. I think I did about 30 interviews, so 30 phone calls with different types of organizations and people across the country. We then had over 100 people complete an online survey. And in fact, if I remember the order of things, we did the online survey first, and the results to that online survey informed the conversations that I had so that I could unpack that survey in more detail with the interviews.
And how long did this take you? Do you remember approximately?
It took about a part of a year.
So 1 year.
That first part. To conduct the, to come up with the questions, both the interview questions and... Wow. The survey questions. I had a small kind of advisory body which, edited and reviewed and commented on all of those phases. Then a several month period of implementation where I was doing the interviews. Now I was only working 2 to 3 days a week at this time, so keeping that in mind, it could be condensed.
Yeah.
And then analysis of the surveys and analysis of the interviews, and that all got compiled into a report called The State of Canada's Freshwater Community.
And is that accessible?
Yeah. It's online at thefreshwateralliance.ca.
That's your website?
That's my website.
Okay, we'll put a link to that. That's great. So back to your analysis, what kind of tools were you using for the analysis? Like, was it just, did you have any methodologies around it? Did you use any tools? Did you use any software? Or did you just kind of go through and say, this is my gut? Like, how did you do that? That's a lot of data.
Yeah. Interviews I really just transcribed and note took. I recorded all of them. In all honesty, I'm not sure I went back and listened to many, although I may have in certain segments. But I took obviously detailed notes during those conversations. I was looking for trends, right? And so when you're having those conversations, you can start to see the trends that are emerging in the conversations. And so I would highlight those and pick those out and test them in future conversations.
Right. So you tire kicked your themes or your trends.
Yeah. And so especially when doing those interviews, it is pretty important that you follow your interview script, right? Because if you're asking interviewer A different questions than interviewer D, then you're gonna get different conversations. And so, I was pretty meticulous at staying with the questions that I wanted to ask, and that then helps you kind of organize and sort your answers. Again, with the survey, I think I use SurveyMonkey for that one. I'm a big fan of Google Forms these days because it's free and accessible. But SurveyMonkey is a great tool and actually organizes your data in a bit more of a comprehensive way. Cool. And so that then again helps you analyze and draw patterns.
So this was 7 years ago. So have you noticed, so in terms of what the themes and things that you found 7 years ago, where are you guys at now in terms of...
It's a very good question. We're hoping to actually replicate the study this year.
Okay.
So that we can do a little bit of a test to see where things have changed, where it's gone, where things have gone. Now, I can certainly anecdotally point to some things that I believe have changed as a result of our work. The freshwater community is much more networked than it was 7 years ago. And there's a number of drivers to that, of which we're certainly one of those. It was one of the big findings in our report was that there were regional networking hubs in the freshwater world, some stronger than others. There was very little cross-section happening nationally.
Right.
And I can pretty confidently say that's changed.
That's great. And do you see that as a direct result of some of the work that you guys have been doing?
Absolutely.
That's cool. What other some of the themes back 7 years ago did you find? Like we were talking about capacity.
Yeah, the biggest theme that we found in our work, which drove our theory of change over the coming over the first 5 years of our existence, was a challenge that organizations were having in connecting with the public on issues of freshwater importance. So there was significant challenges identified by our community around how we reach new audiences in the public, how we engage people in the freshwater world and how we communicate the science of freshwater in a public arena.
Was there anything that shocked you, like that you like? Because obviously you were already in sort of this environmental sphere. Was there anything that you went, "Oh my God, I didn't even see that"? Was from this landscape scan? Did you see anything that shocked you, or just was like, "Oh"?
No, I mean, in all honesty, it was validating assumptions that I had going into that work. Certainly public engagement around environmental issues has been a core focus of my work, and I certainly was looking to see if my assumptions around that were going to hold true across the country, and they certainly did.
Right. And how often should you challenge your assumptions in what you're doing?
I think every day.
Every day? Yeah.
Every day you should be challenging. I mean, our work, and that, I mean, to me, that's one of the bases of all of our theories of change. They're built on our assumptions of what we think is going to bring the change that we want to see. And embedded in the theory of change at the Freshwater Alliance was really about, and it's, I think I said it earlier, we're about building, supporting freshwater constituencies to achieve a future where all Canada's waters are in good health, which is our vision. It's what we're working towards, and we need people engaged on freshwater issues. We don't believe that it's going to happen, that behind closed doors. That in order to get the change that we need to see to have clean, healthy, accessible waters for all, people need to be engaged in that.
That's great. So what about? I'm going to just before we talk about theory of change, because we were talking about, I want to throw this in. So clean water, we talk about Indigenous communities. What kind of work have you guys been doing with the Indigenous communities? Because I know we've talked about it in the past. Mm-hmm. It's something that's you're really passionate about. So in terms of this sort of, social purpose that we're working towards, where do you sit with supporting these Indigenous communities where, the drinking water, there isn't any, essentially?
Well, yeah, I mean, let's be honest. The people in Canada who are most impacted by degraded, polluted, dirty water is Canada's Indigenous populations, particularly those in the north, but not exclusively. When you look at communities that are affected by drinking water advisories, the vast majority of them are Indigenous communities. And so, I mean, I think that drives a lot of the partnerships that we work on in our communities, that we try to foster in the nonprofit world, which tends to be more white settler communities, let's say, and the importance of building those connections. So a project that we're working on in British Columbia right now is about, I think it's sort of called working together, something as simple and difficult as that. But it really is about, there's a community in northern BC that is one of the first in my knowledge in any event to create an Indigenous water law to guide all activities on its Indigenous lands, including the activities of colonial communities.
Right.
And we are hosting a gathering, or in the early days of exploring a gathering, to bring some of BC's nonprofit community to learn and understand that.
Right.
So that as we are moving forward and advocating for water governance and water decision making, we can include how Indigenous laws can actually be governing laws for our fresh water.
Right. So would you consider that almost like a social, that's systemic, really?
Oh,
that
absolutely.
You're working, like social innovation,
yeah,
as opposed to this concept of social entrepreneurship, right? So you're really tackling sort of these two sides of the coin, right? Sort of immobilizing these local communities,
absolutely,
but also using that as the greater push to,
absolutely,
lobby. Changing a law, like an Indigenous law. I mean, that's huge. It's like healthcare, from Tommy Douglas, and
yeah, it's flipping our system on its head a little bit, and saying how, for 150 years this year, we've been enforcing colonial law on Indigenous peoples. Why not try to flip that tide a little bit and start enforcing Indigenous laws on colonial communities.
Yeah, we might be a little bit better off.
And what would that yield?
Yeah. That's a really interesting, actually a very cool, challenging, like a really good flip, right? So that's maybe we'll make an assignment out of that. No, just kidding. Okay. So no, but maybe. No, that I really like that. That's pretty cool. So let's maybe we'll go back to that in a bit, but I really want to get into this concept of theory of change, and how important it is, or how relevant it is to the core of what you do. So, I mean, obviously this course is about social innovation, social entrepreneurship perspectives, and there's sort of two distinct buckets here, where the social innovation is more systemic and social entrepreneurship is more sort of, it has a business or a sustainability model attached to it from an economic standpoint, and it could be a not-for-profit, it could be a corporation that sort of works in these models. But in terms of both of them, I think there's an umbrella to the theory of change, and you can challenge me on that, but let's talk about that a little bit, because how important is that in terms of guiding what you do? Like, you've mentioned it several times, and sort of the work that you guys have been doing. So first of all, what is a theory of change from your perspective?
Well, in our perspective, a theory of change is the cornerstone behind why you're doing what you're doing, for what purpose. And, and what it has done for me in my nonprofit lens is draw a really succinct connection to our niche in creating the change that we want to see.
Right.
Which is different than, when I've facilitated strategic planning sessions for the better part of my career. And the one thing that I had always struggled with when I facilitated those strategic planning sessions is how pie in the sky you would become. You'd be like, we want to solve Canada's freshwater pollution problems, and we're going to do everything to do it, because we need to influence policy, we need to engage the public, we need to do it all. and I never had a tool to be able to break that down before, until I had a theory of change, where a theory of change is talking about the one, I don't want to say silo, but the one the one chain of that broad strategic vision that you really feel you can influence, which is your niche. And so for us, it is about engagement. It's about engaging the public in freshwater issues and concerns. It's not to say that I don't think the policy avenue is the avenue to go, or changing laws is the way to go. Those all have valid theories of change for different organizations. Our niche is about engagement.
Right.
And so we focus. It's not about doing it all. When we're engaged in policy and law, we're engaged from the lens of connecting that with the public. And so it has channeled our activities so that we're not trying to do it all. That if it's not directly related to public engagement strategies, it's not our niche.
Right. And so what happens when you run into that and you're in a group? So this is from the national lens. So you're sitting at the table, and your theory changes. We're concerned about what's the engagement strategy, right? And somebody else might be concerned about policy.
Yeah.
So what happens when you get down to sort of the local level? So how does this theory of change work itself down into the local level? So you're talking to a local, like Lake Simcoe, right? The Lake Simcoe organization. For lack of me, have forgotten their name, but they're a very local group. They're grassroots, they're activists, they're passionate, maybe not so savvy sometimes with working with the municipal level. How does that now, you come in and so how do you collaborate with them under your theory of change? How does that work? Like, not maybe that specifically that organization, but like going back to your partnership in BC.
Yeah, so some of this comes into one, our own social innovation model, which we were founded as a capacity building initiative. And so we have developed a whole training curriculum that we implement with groups and partners on the ground to support advancement of their own engagement issues and challenges. So I come into an organization, pretty much any organization that asks me, and I can run through coaching models. Again, it's focused on engagement strategies, communication strategies, and so we can both explore their own theory of change and how engagement of public audiences is connected to their theory of change, which really can drive the purpose. Why do you want to engage? For what end? And then we can start to work with those organizations to strengthen those strategies. What we're also finding in doing that work, which has been the core part of our work for the last 5 years, is implementing that training module, both one-on-one with organizations. We do online trainings, and then what we're finding now are there are issues that are popping up, right, across the country. So issues like harmful algae is a big issue in Lake Erie in Ontario. It's a big issue in Lake Winnipeg, which are the sort of iconic lakes dealing with algae. But it's also an issue in hundreds of smaller lakes across the country. And so now all of a sudden we see this trend. So where we're going in our own theory of change at the Freshwater Alliance is how can we now connect those local movements and amplify that at a national level.
So this is more just sort of, so this is very like strategic. So here's another now I'm going to take you back down to sort of ground level. So what are you using to do that? Like, so what are some of the basic tools? Like, we've talked about Nation Builder. We've talked about, like, what are just some of the baseline tools? Like, because, this is, when you're running an organization, the technology, and you guys do a lot of engagement in the digital space. So that's fascinating. So how's that?
Well, I have what I call our 5-step model for engagement, and really quickly, because I do, I do 4-part long trainings on this. But step 1 is your theory of change. You can't do anything until you know your theory of change. Step 2 is knowing your audience, your people. You're going to notice some trends in this with marketing, the marketing funnel, so to speak, is, knowing your audience. Again, we need to define, and I'm going to share a little secret beef of mine, but knowing your audiences is probably one of the biggest challenges in the environmental nonprofit sector, because we define our audience as everyone. We want everyone to agree with us.
Right.
And anyway,
that's bad marketing strategy.
Step 2 is we really have to get better at defining who we're trying to reach. Who are our core audience? Who are our first followers? Who are our influencers? Step 3 is defining your stories. So being better storytellers. Step 4 is your engagement strategies, your engagement pyramid, marketing funnel concept. And step 5 is evaluation and data. And so that's my long-winded way of getting to step 5, which is circular. It comes back to your theory of change again and testing your assumptions. So it all leads to my core tool is Nation Builder and my contacts management system. Right. And it seems to be what I find in my one-on-one coaching with organizations. Almost always the first thing that we end up exploring is how they are or are not using their contacts management systems effectively, or whether they have them.
That's probably better.
Going back to the study, the landscape scan that I did when I first started, that was one of my core questions. How are you organizing your contacts with your people? 90% were using Excel spreadsheets.
Ouch. That's not a bad ouch, but it's it's called a startup ouch, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so part of my challenge over this period has been how can we start to make the move from Excel spreadsheets to better systems of organizing, and that doesn't always need to come with a huge cost. Contacts management systems definitely cost, especially the more robust ones, but they offer so much benefit. And I believe and have made the case to most organizations I work with that the return on investment through your fundraising dollars and your ability to integrate some of those more sophisticated systems will pay off.
Right.
I do, again, it's one thing that I want to test. I believe we have changed that number. I certainly think a number of my groups default to Excel spreadsheets in their personal organizing of contacts, but their systems are starting to become more integrated. And what that allows you to do is have more deep relationships with more people than you could ever do in tracking with an Excel spreadsheet.
So it goes back up your steps, right?
Yeah.
So now
Yeah.
you're going back up your steps
Yeah.
again, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
okay, so we've got the data.
Yeah.
So now we know the stories that we need to tell that are resonating.
Exactly.
We know who our influencers are carrying that message. We now know our audience. And then, so it's interesting how, you talked about that pie in the sky and everybody's like, okay, like this, but the rubber hits the road really. And how are we using the technology we have at our disposal?
Yeah.
The old methods of engagement and all that kind of stuff still pan out, but we're living in a digital era now.
Yeah.
Right? And
it's where this sort of concept of engagement organizing has come into play, which is a concept relatively new in our nonprofit world, but is starting to percolate through organizing circles. And really what it does is take the tried, tested, face-to-face tools of community organizing, which, let's be honest, are successful. Nothing beats face-to-face interactions.
right.
But backs them up with the online digital tools to both analyze and understand those face-to-face interactions at a layer of detail that we've never been able to do before, and start making trends.
Right.
And analyzing trends. And it's why, 10 years ago, if you had told me I would have been interested in a big data conference, I would have thought you were crazy.
Right.
Or if I would have been coaching people on database integration and selection,
Right.
I would have thought you were crazy.
Yeah.
But it's become so core to successful organizing and successful engagement that I have had to become an expert in them.
Yeah, well, and I'm always it always blows me away having had a bit of a background in digital, like talking to you. I've always been really impressed at. I'm like, wow, like there's not many people that you would even talk to in business that have the skill set or are leveraging it. And I think that speaks to passion, because this truly is about this is the lifeblood. I think there's and not to wax all Indigenous, because I certainly don't have that background, but, in talking to elders, like this was sort of the last prophecy or the last sort of myth that if we don't fix our water, this is the nail in the coffin for us, really, ultimately as a species, because we can't exist without water.
Well, in a lot of Indigenous storytelling, water is representative of blood flows, right? And the rivers are the veins of the earth.
Right.
And that sort of analogy is very strong in some of the Indigenous storytelling that I've heard and certainly connected to, because it's true, right?
Yeah.
And it sort of seems, it's sort of one of those cliches. You can't live without water.
It's because it's true.
But it's also very true.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know what? Can any of us really envision living in a world where we can't swim in our waters?
Can't drink
We
it.
can't drink our waters without, intense technological treatment.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, that the water treatment facilities are fantastic and we need them, and we probably need more robust ones, but not at the expense of polluting our waterways.
Yeah.
I'm not sure anyone that I've spoken to publicly wants to see that future, where our waters are so polluted that our only choice is treatment. And is it not a really powerful vision to return to the days where you could scoop a water from a stream?
Yeah, that would be great.
and drink it without worry.
Or not worry that your child's taking down a gulp of lake water. You're like, don't drink the lake water,
Exactly.
right?
Or, we've just had 3 days, or a week of pretty intense weather patterns. And I'm going to a birthday party with my youngest daughter tomorrow, and I'm kind of worried about letting her swim in the water, because
Yeah, I guess the sewage is all flowing into the
the
lake.
runoff and Aurelia, we're okay with sewage. We don't have a lot of sewage release events, but the stormwater runs right off into our waters, and that's the prime time for beach closures, because it's right after. You'll notice, if you start to notice the trends, it's 3 days after a big stormwater event, you'll start to see beach closures.
Right.
And that's because of the amount of our poor stormwater infrastructure, number one, and the amount of runoff that happens from our urban environments into the water, and everything we put on our roads on our lawns and our, runs right into our water.
Awesome. So this is very uplifting. Great.
But we can change it.
But that's social innovation and that sort of thing. So let's so I want to go back to your theory of change again.
Yeah.
Keep going back, but it's very important. So let's talk about impact measures and measurement. So the theory of change is essentially, you gave our students in CPI, you gave them a really great kind of, can you tell me what was the statement that you gave to them? Because I'll probably mess it up. If, why.
Oh, okay.
You're like, what? Yeah. What's she talking about?
So I boiled down, in my own trainings on theory of change, I've boiled it down ultimately to one sentence. And obviously you can unpack that sentence into a lot more detail. But I'm like, if you need to be able to fill in the gaps of if we do X, then Y will result because.
Right. ... Right.
And one of the first things that I love to do with organizations when I do a theory of change is I get them all to individually do that sentence.
Right.
So if we do X, then Y will result because. And you'll get a really good gauge right away how in sync that organization is. If they all know their core purpose, then they write this. So I'll use an example. I think they'll be okay with me using them as an example. Reforest London is an organization in London, Ontario, whose mandate mission is to plant 1 million trees. London has been historically known as the forest city.
Storybook Gardens.
Yeah, and they're trying to replenish that image by planting 1 million trees. So they've got a very specific purpose, and when I ask them to do their if-then statements, they're all very similar.
Right.
So that means you've got a team that knows their purpose, knows how they have defined achieving that purpose, and knows why. I can go to another organization and get 10 completely different theories of change, which as soon as you're sharing that light bulb, you'll see that's also a really powerful experience to sort of see light bulbs going off in their heads of, wow, we are a small organization, usually 5, 6, maybe 10 staff, and they've all got very different ideas. And usually that's because they've become siloed. They're all working in their little programmatic areas, and all their programmatic areas have their own theories of change. Some of them are engagement-based, some of them are policy walk-based, some of them are, boots on the ground
right.
based. And they haven't connected it. And so they're all running in their own little circles and essentially running 10 different nonprofits within one. So a big challenge that I have tried to work on in my sector is let's stop trying to do everything, because I also have a theory that when we try to do everything, we end up doing nothing really well.
True. Well, you lose focus, right?
Yeah.
So to move a system, right, a policy, that takes a lot of inertia. You're talking about, how would you rather move a mountain? Would you rather move it with a missile, or would you rather move it with a pebble, right? And if you've got a gazillion pebbles throwing at a mountain, they might notice it, but it's not gonna carve out where the mountain needs to go, right?
Yeah. Well, and inertia is ultimately the biggest challenge of changing paths or focusing a theory of change in an organization. If they have always done things in a particular way in the organization, that organizational inertia is a challenge to move. Even when they all sort of seem to see that there could be a power in coming together around a solid theory of change. It's not always easy to get there.
Do you think that's do you think sometimes that's sort of an insecurity or a fear? If we just
it certainly is.
Yeah, if we just focus on this area, what about all this other stuff?
Yeah.
It'll collapse.
We'll lose it. Yeah, absolutely. Then who will do it? There's there's not enough
funder
of us.
dollars. Yeah. We'll lose that funder dollar because that funder wants.
Well,
to fund
and I actually think that if we analyzed that trend over time, which if any PhD or any of your students who want to analyze that over time, I wouldn't be surprised to see if when X organization was founded, they probably had a very specific purpose.
Right.
Over the years, it grew or developed, and probably my theory would be as a result of what I call fun chasing,
Right.
where you chase money to do good work rather than the dollars to do the theory of change you were once initially focused on. Turns us in all different directions.
Right. But that's a really great term, fun chase. I mean, that's really great. So in terms of social enterprise then, this concept of, is social enterprise the cure to fun chase?
Well, I certainly think it is an added tool.
Right.
Right? I don't think that any nonprofits that I work with, for example, are going to stop philanthropic fundraising.
Right.
But I do think that there is a really interesting opportunity to broaden the work that we do as nonprofits for social good. Mm-hmm. For example, one project I work with had been fundraising and having a difficult time fundraising for this. It's a shoreline restoration program. So they worked with homeowners at restoring natural shorelines it's a core tool in runoff, which we were talking about before. And so I was working with them, and we were working on their theory of change and identifying the landowners as their audiences. And I was like, well, why are we giving this service away for free? Right? And why are we working so hard to fundraise in the philanthropic sector so that we could give this program for free?
Right.
I'm like, are there not landowners who would pay nonprofits to revitalize their shoreline for them?
Yeah.
And so then they started to integrate some of that into their programs and started a fee-for-service model where they actually started, getting paid to actually implement the program.
All under their theory of change.
Under their theory of change. So they're still achieving their theory of change. And sometimes it's just about flipping that mindset. We're used to, in the nonprofit sector, asking money to run our programs for free. And part of innovation in our sector is about starting to think of the service delivery that as nonprofits we give our communities.
Right. And there's value associated with those.
Absolutely.
In terms of our own livelihood, more so than, buying a product per se, or, obviously if it's a social product.
Yeah.
But more so than, okay, so do I pay a landscaping company to make my shoreline great, or could I pay this not-for-profit and it still looks great, but, I've got sort of this blended value proposition that's happening,
Absolutely.
right? And there's this win-win that happens across the board.
Yeah. And that money gets reinvested in the nonprofit purpose.
Right.
Which is, intriguing.
Yeah. So back to measurement then. So if you're working under your theory of change and you've got sort of your strategic vision, and then you've got sort of these, sort of either programs or fees that are happening, how does that now, like you were talking before, like after 7 years, you think, we know, or you feel like we have made these changes. How are we going to measure it? So, we worked on a infographic together or whatever on your theory of change, and you had these really cool structures like impact measures and your four, the four things that you've done. Yeah. How did you talk? Can you talk a little bit about that? Like what that was all about?
Well, that's been a 3-year project. Right. And it is, I mentioned earlier that our big purpose is to achieve a Canada where all waters are in good health.
Right.
That's meta, right? And we do not think that at the Freshwater Alliance we're going to do that alone.
Right.
And so through a number of partnerships that I have had with different individuals and organizations over the years, we co-founded a network called the Our Living Waters Network. And that network is becoming a go-to for any and all organizations, groups, businesses, governments who also believe that goal is something we should aspire to. And so we all came together and we were kind of like, all right, well, if all waters in Canada are in good health by 2030, we made it an ambitious timeline so that we don't just wait 50 years with little action. It's like, let's push for it.
Paris climate.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the first question is, what's the state of the health of Canada's waters right now? And could we actually answer that? And most times we were like, well, I don't know. We've got little anecdotal stories here and there. And so we actually started to look at what we would need to do to measure the health of waters. WWF Canada has been a core partner in the Our Living Waters Network and conceptions of the Our Living Waters Network from day one. 3 years later, I think, no, actually it was 4.5 years later, they just released last week the first comprehensive report on the state of Canada's waters. So now all of a sudden we have a measurement tool that can actually tell us if we're making progress towards that goal.
Right. And then that's directly related to you through your change then?
And that's absolutely.
Yeah.
And at the highest level, it's all ecological health criteria, right? So how healthy are the water's flows, how much water is in there, what the quality of our waters. And then we started to break it down. And if I'm going to remember the process, it was a little iterative, so it wasn't as linear as I think the graphic that we landed on might represent. But from there, we started to think through the 7 winning conditions. And we started, it was probably about 4 years ago now. Because if I recall correctly, the first iteration of the winning conditions came out when I was on a maternity leave. See, I now regulate all time based on the age of my kids.
Yeah, no, I'm not with you.
The first iteration of those 7 winning conditions came out of, okay, so what conditions do we think need to be on the landscape for us to achieve all waters in good health? And so then we came up and, we probably had 20 to begin with and then started to group them and succinct them. So we were like, these 7 winning conditions, this is kind of part of our theory of change, right? If these 7 winning conditions exist, then all waters will be in good health, because we need to move the social and ecological systems that are influenced by those 7 winning conditions to achieve all waters in good health.
So essentially the 7 winning conditions were the pillars,
the
systemic pillars that you were tackling. So, things like legal, policy, public engagement. And then within that, you you figured out measurement tools. So you said, okay, so how would we measure that? Right? It would be the number of people that know about. So really what you're starting to do now is you're starting to break that down into those tools so that you can say, it worked because we know we got 7 winning conditions because 3 communities have changed their water policy under.
So then the 7 winning conditions, we then started to analyze, well, what actually needs, what are the, I think we call them impact measures. What are the impact measures that will start to shift towards those winning conditions? And if we were to go back into the spreadsheets of our impact measures, we have hundreds of impact measures, and we just prioritized based on a relatively simple criteria of how likely is this, how, one of the criteria in our prioritization was how representative is this impact measure to some of the others, how easily accessible is the data, that's just as simple as, do we think we could actually measure this? Some of which it was low, right? We're like, no, we don't, we think this is going to be a pretty hard one. And then, so through that prioritization, a set of 25 impact measures kind of percolated to the top that then become and are starting to shape our priorities.
Right.
So our priority activities are activities that we think are going to move the bar on those impact measures.
So you're like grand architects.
And it'll be forever evolving. There are some big gaps that we've identified already. And, we'll see. And this actually comes full circle to the conversation on Indigenous communities. Is what we're really interested in exploring now is, this is our, you could say that the vast majority of the Our Living Waters Network is colonial organizations, communities. There's been some Indigenous involvement in some of our gatherings, but by no means representative. So what would an Our Living Waters framework look like from an Indigenous lens? And so could we facilitate, help, or empower, how
do you bring them into the conversation?
Development. And that's a conversation that we're continuously having right now. And it's not as, we've gotten so far down our framework that it doesn't feel appropriate to just say, hey, come and join us, and it's living, evolving. We certainly will take input. Would it not be more powerful to develop an Indigenous framework for all waters in good health?
Right.
What does that look like? And then let's let's
Overlay
merge the
yeah.
two, right? And almost in a true nation to nation agreement.
Right. So, and it would be interesting, right? Because I guess in sort of their framework and the way they look, you know, the medicine wheel is such a huge pillar in sort of their thinking, and that cyclical thinking.
Yeah.
And we're also very, you know, and from our colonial background, we're very hierarchical, and
yeah.
you know, so we kind of like we're top down, and,
yeah.
you know, and then okay, then we'll get it,
yeah.
whatever. But it would be interesting to see how those two frameworks would then, because I think the conversation would be the same, because you know you're sort of, you know, we're all human, we're all interconnected, so all those
yeah.
things would still resonate with us. It's just, it is true, like, you know, and you're right. I think if we could maybe just tap into that perspective, you know, we need different thinking for sure,
yeah.
right across the board.
Yeah.
And why not? You know, it's
yeah.
here, you know, and we need to learn.
Yeah.
Right? So that's cool. That's intense, man. So is there anything else you want to say?
Gosh.
Is there any tidbits? So you've got, you know, social entrepreneurship, social innovation. We've really sort of focused on this concept of theory of change today and how you guys are working with that and bringing it down to the local level. Is there anything any advice that you'd want to give to somebody sort of moving in this sector right now, or potentially wanting to move into this sector? Not necessarily per se in freshwater, but just in general, like this whole crazy world of nonprofit converging with, you know, sort of having change happen, or just change happening, period, not even like in any.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it comes back to the core of why we're talking about theory of change, and why, and the importance of really formulating a strong theory of change from the beginning, because it can focus. It's so easy in the nonprofit world to lose your focus, because there are so many competing elements. No, whether you're looking at freshwater, or whether you're looking at poverty, or whether you're looking at hunger.
They're all connected.
You know, and so because of that, it's so easy to try to tackle it all. And I think the most powerful movements that I've seen are the ones that have been laser focused. And it's not that it's not connected to a bigger system, but it's about, we believe that if we move this element of the system, then it will have a snowball effect.
Right.
And it tends to, you know, so I'm looking at like again, I'll use the water example because they come to my head easily. You know, if you think of the Wellington Water Watchers and this whole movement around Nestle, water extraction in the Guelph area. And they have been, it's not that they're not concerned about the whole plethora of water issues, but they've been like, if we can move the bar on how we let corporations extract our municipal water in many cases, or our groundwater, and if we can move that, then it will have a snowball effect on that bigger system.
Right.
And their theory of change is very laser focused, and they're creating a pretty powerful movement that is actually influencing provincial policy right now.
Right.
You know, water pricing, bottle pricing effects went in, you know, this week, where water bottling companies are getting charged exponentially more than what they have before to extract water. And that's a result of this movement. And it will have a snowball effect on both how we understand groundwater, and how we let companies take our groundwater before we actually even know. It's like taking money out of your bank account without ever looking at your balance.
Right.
Or not even knowing what your balance is. That's how we extract groundwater in Canada. And that will have a snowball effect on so many things. And so that's the biggest advice that I give to anybody who's thinking about social enterprise, nonprofit, starting down that path, is get laser focused on what your snowball is.
Right.
And don't try to do it all. Because your theory of change is, if I move this piece of the system, then the bigger system will change.
That's right. And you know, you're going up against corporations. Like you talk about Nestle. Like Nestle has a very clear corporate agenda,
yeah.
Right? And so why wouldn't a not-for-profit, why wouldn't a movement, why wouldn't an organization not have that same clarity? And you know, I think that's sort of the Achilles heel in a lot of ways, is because these corporations are, you know, they might be profit mandated, and I'm not saying that that's wrong. It's just that's how they are, and that's how they can operate. Mm-hmm. And they can go in and they have a very clear mandate. They have people with very clear mandates. And you're right, I think this is just sort of an anecdotal, but if you can come at them with the same framework, you know, using their strengths against them, you know, then you can go head to head with them. and they can't snowball, and they can't snowball you. They can't roll you over, right?
Yeah.
So no.
Yeah, and the more laser focused you are on that, and that's why it does. And I think you as an instructor harp on that theory of change, and why me as a coach in the nonprofit world, I harp on that theory of change, because I'm like, I can see it, and if I can't influence you to change it, then I will see over time that'll be a continual challenge that you'll face.
Yeah.
Because you'll continuously come back to having too broad, not specific enough of a theory of change, and then your actions aren't leading to the result. And that's the power. And it's as a company, it's what your investors are looking for. Right. They want to see the results. As a nonprofit social enterprise, your funders, your supporters, your clients are looking towards you also being able to point to the change, the results. And the more laser focused your theory of change is, the more you're going to be able to point to the results. And that goes back to Our Living Waters Network. Our whole purpose is about, can we start to point to change on the landscape over time towards healthy waters in Canada? And if we can't do that, then our movement is failing. And let's be clear and transparent on that, so that we can challenge ourselves not. Because I think that, I'm in the freshwater world because I believe it's a movement that can't fail.
Right. No, it's not. There's a lot at stake. The other thing too is, on the other side of it, I was just thinking too, like, we're talking to, in startup culture, keeping talent. So if you want the best talent, you have to be clear on what you want. Right? Because if you need, like you said, going back to your tools, like if the database is really important, then you're going to need that kind of talent in your organization, so you can plan and structure for it, just like you would in a business. Yeah. And that's one of the biggest structures I see in sort of startup environments, whether you're not profit or for profit, is the clearer you get, the people show up to help you along the way, because it aligns with, it's the bottom value. Yeah. So it really aligns from values from funders to staff to volunteers to whatever. So. Yeah. Cool. Wow, that was fun. Did you like that?
Yeah, I hope it makes sense.
No, I think it will, and I think it's good, and we'll take a look at that infographic to show the reference and some of the theory of change, and we'll go from there. So, is there any? So, what's your website again? I'll put it online. But what is it? It's Freshwater Alliance.
I have numerous websites, but freshwateralliance.ca, ourlivingwaters.ca, which we've also talked about quite a bit in this conversation.
Okay. Great. Fantastic.
Both going through overhauls at the moment.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other story. Anyways. All right. Well, thank you, Lindsay. I really appreciate your time. And go save our waters, man.